Just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, my stomach let out a loud growl, protesting against the lack of food in it. The sound startled me, and I placed a hand on my stomach, feeling the emptiness there. With a sigh, I realized I was hungry. Getting out of bed, I decided to make myself a midnight snack to settle my rumbling stomach. I slipped out of bed, the cold floor against my bare feet sending a chill up my spine. I padded quietly down the stairs, the sounds of the creaking floorboards the only sound in the quiet house. When I reached the kitchen, I turned on the light, the sudden brightness making me squint for a moment as my eyes adjusted. I opened the fridge, its soft hum filling the room as I pondered what snack to make for myself. After a moment of consideration, I decided to make a simple but satisfying snack of pork chop with rice and corn. I grabbed the necessary ingredients from the fridge and pantry, setting them out on the countertop. With practiced ease, I started chopping the pork into bite-sized pieces, the sound of the knife against the cutting board, adding some oil and seasonings to it. As the pork cooked, I prepared the rice and corn, boiling them together in another pan. The smell of the cooking pork and rice began to fill the kitchen, a savory aroma that made my mouth water in anticipation. The sound of the pork sizzling in the pan and the bubbling of the rice and corn added a comforting soundtrack to the peaceful night. A small smile tugged at the corner of my mouth as I stood by the stovetop, the sight and smell of the food making me feel more relaxed. As I continued cooking, my mind drifted back to my visit to Bikini Bottom, replaying memories of meeting SpongeBob and visiting the iconic Krusty Krab. The thought brought a smile to my face, the vivid images of the colorful city and its quirky inhabitants filling my mind. I could remember SpongeBob's energetic and cheerful demeanor, always ready with a smile and a joke. I chuckled to myself, missing the company of the friendly sea sponge. With the food prepared, I turned off the stove and set the pan aside to let the food cool a little. The kitchen was now filled with the delicious scent of the pork chop, rice, and corn, making my stomach grumble even louder in anticipation. I took a moment to admire the food I had made, the sight of the steaming, savory dish eliciting an appreciative hum from my lips. I took a seat at the kitchen table and started digging into the food, the first bite sending a wave of delicious flavors across my taste buds. The pork was tender and juicy, coated in a savory spice mixture that made it even more delicious. The combination of the pork, rice, and corn made a satisfyingly filling meal. With each bite, the taste and smell brought back memories of my time in Bikini Bottom, and I found myself missing the vibrant city even more. As I savored every bite of my meal, a sense of contentment washed over me. The flavors of the pork chop, rice, and corn combined to form a delicious and satisfying meal, one that not only filled my stomach but also brought back memories of my adventure in Bikini Bottom. By the time I had polished off the last bite, a feeling of fullness and satisfaction had settled in, a small smile tugging at my lips. With the meal finished, I took a moment to savor the taste still lingering on my tongue. The feeling of satisfaction and fullness was pleasant, a comfortable weight in my stomach. I then got up and started to clean the dishes I had used to cook my meal. The quiet clink of dishes and the sound of running water filled the kitchen as I washed and wiped them clean, putting them away in their proper places. With the dishes all cleaned and put away, I turned off the kitchen light and headed back up the stairs to my bedroom. The house was quiet once more, the only sound the soft creak of the stairs under my weight. As I reached my bedroom, I climbed back into bed, the soft sheets and comfortable mattress enveloping me in their familiar embrace. As I lay in bed, the memories of Bikini Bottom swirled through my mind once more, this time focusing on the Krusty Krab. I thought about the iconic restaurant, its cheerful red and white exterior, and the friendly face of SpongeBob waiting behind the counter. A small smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as I recalled the taste of a Krabby Patty, the signature sandwich of the Krusty Krab. The thought made my stomach grumble a little, but I quickly squashed the feeling, knowing I had just eaten a satisfying meal. After a last few moments of contemplation, I gradually felt sleep start to take over. My eyelids grew heavy, and my thoughts began to slow down. Soon, the world around me began to fade, and I found myself sinking into a deep, peaceful slumber. I was abruptly awoken from my deep sleep by a sudden change in my surroundings. One moment I was in the quiet comfort of my bedroom, and the next I found myself sitting in a room I didn't recognize. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized I was in Mr. Krab's office, the familiar surroundings of the iconic restaurant visible beyond the large window. Confused and disoriented, I rubbed my eyes and sat up in the chair, trying to figure out how I ended up here. I glanced towards the clock hanging on the wall, its neon red numbers indicating that it was 3 o'clock in the morning. A pang of surprise shot through me. How had I ended up in the Krusty Krab in the middle of the night? I tried to remember the events leading up to this moment, but my memory was fuzzy and indistinct. As I looked around the office, trying to make sense of the situation, a thought struck me. Could it be possible that I had been teleported here somehow? My heart thumped a little faster in my chest as the thought took root in my mind. It seemed far-fetched, but then again, I was currently sitting in Mr. Krab's office in the midst of the night. Anything seemed possible at this point. I silently made my way to the office door and stepped outside, the cold air sending a shiver down my spine. Looking out at the front of the Krusty Krab, I caught sight of a bus parked in the otherwise deserted street. The sight was confusing, seeing a bus there at such an odd hour of the night. I furrowed my brows, trying to make sense of the situation. What was a bus doing here in the middle of the night? And why did the sight of it seem strangely familiar to me? My eyes widened as I took a closer look at the creature across the street. The realization suddenly dawned on me, confirming my worst fears. This was the hash-slinging slasher, a feared figure in bikini-bottom folklore. My heart thudded against my chest, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I was now face to face with a legendary horror, alone and vulnerable in the dead of night. With the slasher's sudden disappearance, the lights in the room began to flicker and dim, casting the whole area in a dim... My heart dropped into my stomach as I realized what was about to happen. This was it. The hash-slinging slasher was about to spawn, and I was in the perfect place for him to appear. Terror gripped me as I quickly retreated back to the office, my legs moving on pure adrenaline. Within moments, I was inside and slammed the door shut behind me. Without wasting a moment, I started throwing whatever objects I could find against the door, creating a makeshift barricade between me and the outside. Furniture, boxes, and anything else that was within reach were shoved against the door, creating a desperate defense. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I continued to barricade myself into the office, piling more and more objects against the door. Thoughts raced through my mind in a confusing, jumbled mess. Why was this happening to me? How had the hash-slinging slasher found me here, in the middle of the night, at the Krusty Krab? As I continued to barricade the door, desperation and fear coursing through my veins, a sudden realization struck me. This entire situation felt eerily reminiscent of a horror game I had heard of. 3 a.m. at the Krusty Krab by Dave Microwave Games. The pieces were clicking together in my mind, the terrifying similarities becoming starker by the minute. But no, it couldn't be. This was real life, not some scary video game. My eyes caught sight of the to-do list hanging on the wall next to the door, each task written in neat, precise handwriting. With a sudden realization, I felt a chill run down my spine. This was all unfolding just like the game. A to-do list, the hash-slinging slasher, the flickering lights. It was all too similar to be coincidence. A wave of panic washed over me as I accepted the terrifying truth that I was stuck in a hellish nightmare version of the game. I clutched my hands over my mouth, stifling any sound of fear that threatened to escape. The sudden spawn cue filled my ears, sending a fresh shiver down my spine. Carefully, I peeked through the office door window into the dining area. Outside the door, the slasher was prowling around the room, his spatula raised menacingly. In the flickering light, his face was a terrifying snarl, and his eyes glowed a bright, burning red. The moment the slasher vanished, the breath I had been holding burst out of me in a shuddering gasp. It was only a momentary reprieve, though, and my heart ached with terror as I remembered. The respawn cycle would continue, tormenting me in this horrific, unending nightmare. Tears welled up in my eyes as the realization sank in. I was trapped in an endless loop with a malevolent horror. How could I ever escape this living hell? Hope flickered in my terrified heart as I remembered the to-do list. It was the key to my escape. I had to accomplish the tasks on the list to break out of this horrifying loop. With trembling hands, I took a closer look at the list, reading the task. No idea what horrors I would have to face to complete them, but I knew I had no choice but to try. With a deep breath, I steeled myself as I read through the objectives. Number 1 was to gather all the money from the cash register in Mr. Krab's office. That would be easy enough, as long as the slasher didn't show up in the meantime. Task number 2 was to pack the leftover Krabby Patties, while the third was to check the bathroom trash bin for pennies. But the last task was what worried me, to lock up and leave. A new wave of fear washed over me as I remembered that crucial part. If the game was following the same story, then that meant I would have to find the basement key, which was hidden deep in the creepy, eerie basement. The thought of venturing into the basement sent a shiver down my spine, especially knowing the fearsome hash-slinging slasher could spawn at any moment. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around and spotted the pile of money on the desk. The sight reminded me of the first objective on the list, to gather all the money from the cash register in Mr. Krab's office. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I moved over to the desk and picked up the money, feeling its weight in my trembling hands. I carefully placed the money into a plastic bag. The sound of the bills rustling together seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence of the office. My heart was racing, the knowledge that the slasher could appear at any moment making my hands shake as I counted the denominations. A small measure of relief washed over me as I recalled that the office was a safe spot. That meant I was momentarily free from the slasher's terrifying presence. The knowledge that he only spawned in the kitchen, dining area, and bathroom was reassuring, as long as I could stay in the office. It was a small comfort in this horrifying nightmare. With a sense of trepidation, I stepped out of the relative safety of the office and into the dining area, carefully closing the door behind me. The silence in the room was heavy and oppressive, and I had half expected to see a menacing figure lurking in the shadows. Thankfully, the slasher wasn't in sight, and so I crept to the cash register. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the cash register and started to gather the money, carefully counting each bill and coins. The silence of the room was deafening, and every sound sent a shiver down my spine, making me glance over my shoulder periodically, half expecting the slasher to appear behind me. Once again, I was ensconced in relative safety inside the office, the closed door serving as a barrier between me and the menacing slasher. My pulse thundered in my ears as I waited for the sound that signaled his despawn, the sudden silence of the office seeming eerie and ominous. As the slasher disappeared, I took a steadying breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I knew I had to press on with the objectives, and gathering the leftover Krabby Patties was the next task on the to-do list. With newfound determination, I stepped out of the office and made my way into the kitchen. I entered the kitchen, my eyes sweeping the area for the leftover Krabby Patties. Thankfully, they were easy to spot. A large platter full of them sat on a shelf next to the grill. With a mix of relief and unease, I started packing them into another plastic bag, each patty feeling cold and heavy in my hands. The smell of the Krabby Patties wafted around me, filling the kitchen with their appetizing aroma. Despite the hunger that began to pang within me, I fought the urge to stop and eat. Staying focused and task-oriented was crucial to surviving this hellish nightmare. With the patties packed away, I steeled myself for the next objective, checking the bathroom trash bin for any pennies. I approached the bathroom door with a mixture of dread and determination, fully aware of the horrors that could be lurking inside. As I began to dig through the trash bin, a wave of relief washed over me as I realized that it contained only paper and towels. No gross or revolting items here, just scraps of paper and tissue. I rummaged around, collecting any pennies that I could find, each coin feeling like a small victory in this nightmare. As I continued to root through the trash, I couldn't help but wonder aloud, who the hell throws pennies in the trash? Those things can add up, you know. It was baffling to think that people would just throw away loose change, but hey, who was I to judge in this crazy horror nightmare scenario? With the pennies collected, I knew the next step was the most daunting yet, venturing into the basement. Fear gripped my heart as I thought about going down there, knowing that horrors beyond my imagination awaited me. But there was no turning back now. I had to find the key and complete the third objective. As I returned to the office, my eyes immediately fell on the trapdoor next to the desk. The sight of it filled me with a mixture of anticipation and terror. This was it, the point of no return. With trembling footsteps, I stepped closer to the trapdoor and prepared to descend into the unknown horrors of the Krusty Krab basement. The air was cold and dank as I stepped into the basement, the sound of the trapdoor closing behind me echoing eerily in the cramped space. Darkness surrounded me on all sides, only a few dim lights casting ominous shadows across the room. Fear clawed at my heart, making my breath come in short, ragged gasps. Every instinct told me to turn back, to escape from this nightmare, but I knew I had no choice. I had to press on and find the basement key. Feeling my way through the basement, I moved past crates of Krabby Patty meat and other supplies, each step feeling like a lifetime. The dim lighting cast macabre shadows across the space, and every sound, from the creak of a floorboard to the rustle of a box, had me jolting in fear, expecting the slasher to materialize out of the darkness at any moment. As I approached the next doorway, I froze in terror. The sound of the slasher's heavy footsteps shattered the quiet, sending a jolt of panic through my body. Every muscle tensed, every nerve on edge as I stood completely still, praying he wouldn't notice me. Thankfully, I managed to stay hidden in the shadows, and the slasher walked right past the doorway without noticing my presence. Relief flooded through me as I spotted the basement key resting on a small box around the corner. Its silvery gleam stood out against the dark surroundings, like a beacon of hope in this hellish nightmare. Reaching out, I picked it up, the metal feeling cold and heavy in my hand. With the key securely in my possession, I now had to make my way back to the ladder. The darkness of the basement seemed even deeper and more ominous now, but I was determined to get out of there alive. Taking a deep breath, I started retracing my steps, carefully moving through the maze of crates and supplies, my heart racing with every step. Terror coursed through me as the slasher appeared around the corner, its imposing figure blocking my path to the ladder. Its eyes blazed with malevolent fury as it locked onto me, and a split second later, it launched itself at me with a snarl. Panic overwhelmed my senses, and I spun on my heel and dashed off as fast as I could, desperately searching for a safe place to hide, praying I could outrun the slasher's relentless pursuit. The air was thick with the tension as I darted through the labyrinthine corridors of the basement, the slasher hot on my heels. Every step was a desperate effort to stay ahead, but the slasher's relentless pursuit made it harder and harder to escape. I turned corners, dashed through stacks of crates, and used every hiding place I could find. But the slasher always seemed to appear a moment later, its red eyes burning with a bloodthirsty fury. As I burst into view of the ladder, hope surged through me. That was my ticket out of this nightmare. Summoning every ounce of strength and courage I had left, I launched myself at the ladder, climbing as fast as my legs would take me. I could hear the slasher close on my heels, its heavy footsteps shaking the entire ladder, but I refused to look back, my focus solely on reaching the top. Gasping for breath, my heart racing like a runaway train, I managed to scramble back into the office, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. Leaning back against the heavy oak desk, I took a moment to compose myself, letting the relief wash over me. I'd made it out of the basement, but the nightmare was far from over. As the adrenaline started to fade, I became acutely aware of a gnawing feeling in my stomach. The intense running I had done while escaping the basement seemed to have agitated my stomach, causing a wave of nausea to wash over me. It was as if the horror and terror I had experienced had settled heavily within my gut, making me feel queasier by the second. Unable to control it anymore, the nausea quickly overwhelmed me, and I stumbled out of the office and towards the front entrance. I barely made it outside before I began retching, the contents of my stomach expelling from my body in a violent rush. The vomit splattered on the cobblestone in front of the restaurant, a testament to the absolute nightmare of a situation I was in. Taking a moment to steady myself, I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. Once I felt somewhat in control, I turned and closed the doors of the restaurant, the clank of the lock echoing in the empty silence. I let out a shaky sigh, knowing that the slasher wouldn't be able to get in here now, at least for a while. With the restaurant locked behind me, I made a beeline for the car in the parking lot. My legs still trembled from the ordeal, but I forced myself to keep moving, knowing that every second counted. As I reached the car, I fumbled for the keys with shaking hands, my eyes constantly darting around to make sure the slasher wasn't lurking nearby. Slipping into the car, I closed the door and locked it. The sound of the engine roaring to life was a small comfort as I pulled out of the parking lot, desperately eager to put some distance between myself and the horrors of the restaurant. I kept watchful eyes on the rearview mirror, expecting the slasher to appear at any moment, but the road remained clear as I drove away from that hellhole. The drive, despite only being half an hour, felt like an eternity. Every twist and turn in the road had me on edge, my heart leaping into my throat at every shadow or shape that flickered in the corner of my eye. The silence within the car was oppressive, my mind still filled with memories of the horrors I had just experienced. The road stretched on, the shadows of the surrounding trees dancing menacingly in the moonlight. Then, in the distance, the outline of Floater's cemetery came into view, its haunting presence filling me with a mixture of dread and determination. As I pulled up to the cemetery, the clock on the dashboard read 3:30 in the morning, the witching hour. As the cold wind from the cemetery whipped around the car, a memory tugged at the edges of my mind. 3:30 a.m. at Floater's Cemetery. It was a game I had stumbled across before, developed by Dave Microwave Games, the same creator behind the infamous 3 a.m. at the Krusty Krab. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I was about to embark on another nightmare, but this time it was based on a graveyard. As I sat in the car, I patted my pocket out of habit, and my fingers wrapped around something thin and paper-like. Curious, I fished it out, revealing it as a small slip of paper I had forgotten I had. I unfolded it and stared at it, my confusion mounting. I stared down at the paper in disbelief, my eyes darting from line to line as I read through the list. Dig up Smitty Werbenman Jensen's grave, Wally the Walrus's grave, Mr. Puff's grave, plunder all 3 mausoleums, and leave the cemetery. What the hell did this mean? Another to-do list? My heart sank as the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Of course, it all made sense now. Mr. Krabs had gone grave robbing after that nightmare at the Krusty Krab, and now it seemed that I was supposed to do the same. But the thought of committing such a sacrilegious act left a bitter taste in my mouth. Grave robbing was a crime, and the idea of disrespecting the dead in such a way made my stomach churn. As I thought about the possible enemies within the game, my dread intensified further. The Flying Dutchman, Old Man Jenkins, and... My eyes widened in terror as the last name on the list sunk in. The hash-slinging slasher. That nightmarish being was back, a part of this cursed grave-digging mission. I parked the car outside the entrance to the cemetery, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I closed my eyes and clasped my hands together, silently offering a prayer for forgiveness. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, and I could feel the weight of the task before me like a heavy stone in my stomach. With a sigh, I looked to the passenger seat and spotted a solitary lamp that I had forgotten was there. The cemetery would be pitch black without a source of light, and so I picked it up, holding it tightly in my grasp the way a child might clutch a stuffed animal in the dark. As I stepped out of the car, the cold night air enveloped me like a ghostly embrace. I tried to steel my nerves, my hands clenching and unclenching involuntarily as I faced the yawning entrance of the cemetery. The lantern in my hand provided a meager comfort, casting a small circle of light around me as I began my march into the graveyard. Following the left pathway, I continued deeper into the cemetery, the soft glow of the street lamps lighting my way. Shadows danced ominously between each gravestone, the atmosphere thick with an eerie silence that seemed to stifle every sound. The only sound audible was the distant hoot of an owl, the perfect soundtrack to this nightmare. As I continued my trepidation journey through the graveyard, I stopped in front of a modest grave adorned with a few wilting flowers. The nameplate read, Mr. Puff, in a simple, yet elegant font. This had to be it, the first grave I was supposed to dig up. I knelt in front of Mr. Puff's grave, the cold earth rough beneath my fingers as I prepared to start digging. My heart felt heavy with guilt, and I found myself apologizing to Mr. Puff for what I was about to do. Every scoop of dirt that came up was like a dagger to my conscience, and I began to wonder if I should really go through with this. But the fear of the consequences for disobedience outweighed these qualms, and so I pushed on, slowly but surely making progress on the grave. Eventually, my shovel hit something hard and metallic, causing me to pause my digging. I brushed away the remaining dirt, revealing a small metal box. It appeared unmarred by time, its surface smooth and unscathed. With a mixture of relief and trepidation, I retrieved the box and opened it, revealing the treasure that lay inside. A handful of glistening pearls. As I looked at the pearls, their beauty and value staring up at me from the box, I was struck by a pang of guilt. These were Mr. Puff's treasures, and I had no right to touch them. With a deep sigh, I closed the box and gently placed it back in the grave, covering the dirt back up with care. I stood up and took a moment to say another silent prayer for Mr. Puff, hoping he would forgive me for disturbing his final resting place. After covering Mr. Puff's grave, I turned and continued down the pathway, feeling the weight of my actions with every step. The cemetery seemed even more ominous now, the shadows from the gravestones and the trees like silent sentinels watching my every move. As I walked, I tried to focus on my current objective, searching for Smitty Werbenman Jensen's grave. My eyes widened in horror as I turned and saw Old Man Jenkins charging towards me, a shovel in hand and a menacing glare in his eyes. The flickering light of his lamp played across his face, making his expression even more fearsome. It was clear he planned to stop me in my tracks. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I took in Old Man Jenkins' appearance. His smile was twisted and unnatural, his teeth crooked and yellowed. The way his eyes looked in two different directions only added to the nightmarish image. It was clear that he was not a man to mess with, and I braced myself for whatever confrontation was about to occur. "Crap!" I muttered under my breath as I quickly darted into a nearby cluster of tall bushes, trying to make myself as small and hidden as possible. My heart thumped in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I held my breath, hoping Old Man Jenkins hadn't seen me slip into the undergrowth. As I silently crouched in the bushes, I watched carefully as Old Man Jenkins wandered away, his flickering lamplight fading into the distance. With every step he took, my heartbeat slowly returned to a more normal pace. It seemed I had successfully eluded him, for now. As I watched Old Man Jenkins' retreating figure, a thought occurred to me. In the show, Mr. Krabs and Old Man Jenkins were friendly towards each other. So why was he suddenly an enemy now? The sudden change in his behavior was perplexing, and I could feel my confusion growing. It was as if the rules of this game had been twisted and mutated for my torment. It was as if a light bulb went off in my head. Of course, this was a fan game, so the rules and characters didn't have to stick to the original SpongeBob canon. The developers had taken the basic premise and twisted it to fit their own vision, even if that meant making friends into enemies. With a sense of determination, I emerged from my hiding place in the bushes and continued my trek through the cemetery. The atmosphere was tenser now, the knowledge that Old Man Jenkins could be lurking in the shadows adding to my anxiety. I pushed forward, my grip on the lantern growing tighter with every step. As I explored the graveyard, my eyes landed on a familiar shape, Smitty's grave. It stood out amongst the sea of tombstones, its bold #1 shape catching my attention. Memories of SpongeBob singing Smitty's praises in the show flickered through my mind, and I couldn't help but smirk at the irony of it all. Here I was, about to dig up Smitty's grave, all because of a stupid to-do list. I remembered the iconic #1 drink hat that Smitty was always seen wearing, the one he had been buried in, according to SpongeBob. A part of me was tempted to leave the hat undisturbed, to respect Smitty's final resting place. But then again, the to-do list didn't mention anything about the hat. I gritted my teeth as I dug into Smitty's grave, digging up the dirt and uncovering the casket below. But as my hand came across the hat, I paused. Memories of SpongeBob talking about Smitty's love for that hat filled my mind, and I found myself unable to bear the thought of taking it. I had already committed enough sacrilege by digging up Smitty's grave, but desecrating his hat felt like crossing a line I wasn't willing to cross. As I looked upon Smitty's skeletal face, his hat still perched perfectly on his head, a wave of sadness washed over me. In death, Smitty looked peaceful, his skeleton frozen in time, forever resting inside his final resting place. I reached out a trembling hand and gently patted his skull, suddenly feeling a deep sense of respect for the man I was disturbing. I mentally wished him a well-deserved rest, hoping he would forgive me for my transgression. With a heavy heart, I slowly closed Smitty's coffin and began to fill the grave back up, covering the casket with the loose dirt that I had dug up. The sound of the earth hitting the lid echoed in my ears, each shovel full like a nail being hammered into my own conscience. As I finished, I stepped back and looked at Smitty's grave, a pang of regret washing over me once more. As I stood by Smitty's freshly covered grave, I made a decision. I would continue to the next 2 graves and dig them up, but I wouldn't take any of the treasures. Instead, I would simply look at them and then cover the grave back up. This way, I was technically plundering the graves, but I was still respecting the dead and not actually stealing anything. It wasn't the most honest way to play the game, but it was the only way I could find to reconcile my conscience with the to-do list demands. Leaving Smitty's grave behind, I continued walking through the cemetery, the flickering light from my lantern cutting through the darkness. Wally the Walrus's grave was my next objective, and I searched the rows for any sign of his tombstone. The silence of the cemetery was only broken by the soft sound of my footsteps, the atmosphere feeling more intenser with every step. My heart skipped a beat as I spotted the Flying Dutchman hovering in the air, his ghostly form a menacing sight in the dim cemetery. Panic welled up within me, and I quickly darted behind a large mausoleum, pressing myself flat against the cold stone. I held my breath, praying that the Flying Dutchman hadn't seen me. I listened closely to the Flying Dutchman's howling and chanting. Every "I'm the Flying Dutchman" thundered through the quiet cemetery, adding to the mounting tension. It was as if he was taunting me, letting me know that he was searching for me and that he wouldn't rest until he found me. With the Flying Dutchman's attention momentarily directed away, I saw my chance. I quietly emerged from my hiding spot behind the mausoleum and dashed towards it. My lantern's light played across the stone structure, the shadows dancing like sinister puppets in the night. With each step, my heart pounded louder in my chest. The knowledge that the Flying Dutchman could return at any second, making every movement feel like a gamble. I finally reached the mausoleum and quickly searched for any treasures buried inside. As my eyes roamed over the stones, I spotted a small wooden box tucked into a crevice in the wall. My hand quickly grabbed it, curiosity and fear mixing in my mind as I hurriedly opened it. I closed the wooden box and placed it back where I had found it, taking a moment to collect myself. The fear of the Flying Dutchman returning at any moment still lingered, but I pressed on, moving away from the mausoleum and continuing my search for the remaining graves and mausoleums. The tension was at an all-time high, and my lantern cast shifting shadows across the graveyard in a macabre dance. As I emerged from the mausoleum's safety, I suddenly froze in terror. There, rushing towards me across the graveyard, was the hash-slinging slasher. The moonlight caught his blade, the metal gleaming ominously as he charged at me. My heart pounded in my chest, panic setting in as I realized I was caught in the slasher's line of sight. My blood was pumping like a drum, my heart threatening to leap out of my chest as I sprinted away from the slasher. The lantern in my hand swung wildly, casting an unsteady light across the cemetery as I raced through the gravestones and dark shadows, the slasher hot on my heels. I dared not look back, fear and adrenaline fueling every stride I took, pushing me forward in an attempt to outpace the deadly assailant. Panting and desperate for safety, I quickly dashed behind a nearby gravestone, pressing my body against the cold stone. My eyes were wild and every muscle was taut, my mind screaming for the slasher to run right past me. The cemetery was eerily silent, except for the sound of my own haggard breathing, each gasp feeling like a bell tolling in the quiet night. The sudden sound of the slasher vanishing was like a breath of fresh air. I exhaled deeply, the tension leaving my body in waves. My heart was still racing, but the knowledge that I was safe, at least for now, brought a sense of relief. With shaky hands, I pushed myself off the gravestone, my eyes darting around for any sign of the slasher returning. My eyes widened as I turned and looked at the grave I had hidden behind. The nameplate read, "Captain Stupid," in bold, mocking letters. A sardonic laugh almost escaped my lips as I realized the grave I had ducked behind was the very one I needed to dig. With a mix of trepidation and resignation, I knelt down at the foot of Captain Stupid's grave. My hands trembled as I gripped the shovel, my mind still racing from my encounter with the slasher and the Flying Dutchman. Taking a deep breath, I plunged the shovel into the cold dirt. My lantern's light illuminated the treasure within Captain Stupid's grave. The gleam of gold and gemstones like a siren's call to my tired mind. A moment of temptation passed through me, the thought of keeping one or two of the treasures fluttering across my thoughts. But shaking my head, I quickly covered the grave back up, trying to ignore the dull pang of regret. "Oh no," was all I could think as I turned to find the 3 enemies charging towards me, their gazes filled with malice. Old Man Jenkins led the charge, the shovel in his hands raised like a deadly weapon. The Flying Dutchman was right behind him, his ghostly form flickering menacingly in the dim light. And rounding out the trio was the Hash, slinging Slasher, his blade gleaming as he rushed towards me with sinister intent. With 3 powerful enemies bearing down on me, my priorities shifted. Staying alive suddenly became much more important than completing the game. I made a split-second decision and dropped the shovel, no longer caring about the remaining objectives. All I wanted to do now was escape. I turned on my heel and sprinted with all my might into the darkness, praying that my legs could carry me away from the nightmarish creatures closing in on me. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest as I bolted away from the pursuing enemies, every muscle in my body pushed to its limit. The cemetery's tombstones and mausoleums blurred around me, the darkness swallowing me whole. I sprinted forward, guided by a desperate instinct rather than any clear sense of direction, hoping against hope that the exit was somewhere ahead. I glanced back, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I saw the enemies still hotly pursuing me. Fear gripped my chest, the knowledge that they were gaining on me fueling my efforts to run even faster. The cemetery was like a labyrinth, its shadows and tombstones conspiring to slow me down and lead me astray. I spotted the exit ahead, a beacon of hope in the dark cemetery. A fresh wave of energy surged through my body, propelling me forward like a bullet. My legs were screaming in protest, but I pushed through the pain, determined to reach the exit before the enemies caught up to me. With the exit in sight, I pushed myself harder, the promise of safety just a few more strides away. My breath was ragged and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but I powered through, refusing to let exhaustion win, refusing to let the enemies catch me. With a final burst of speed, I reached the exit and threw myself into the car, slamming the door shut and sinking into the seat, breathing heavily. My hands trembled as I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, the sound like a sweet anthem to my ears. I put the car into drive, ripped the emergency brake off, and floored the gas pedal, my foot to the metal as I sped out of the cemetery and down the road like a bat out of hell. The cemetery was behind me, the adrenaline from the chase still coursing through my veins. My foot pressed down on the gas pedal harder, the speedometer needle climbing higher and higher. I was probably hitting 80 miles per hour, the world outside a blur of trees and streetlights as I sped down the road, desperate to put as much distance between me and the cemetery as possible. The fog appeared out of nowhere, wrapping around the car like a thick ethereal blanket. The visibility outside was suddenly reduced to near zero, the world outside the car's windows fading to a fuzzy gray. My hands tightened around the wheel, the sudden change in conditions adding to the tension I already felt. I blinked, confused and disoriented. The fog had vanished as quickly as it appeared, revealing my familiar suburban street and the familiar outline of my house. I looked around in bewilderment, the events of the past few hours feeling like a fever dream. Relief washed over me as I stepped out of the car, the familiar surroundings feeling like a safe haven after the harrowing adventure I had just been on. I stood in the driveway for a moment, just breathing in the cool night air and letting my heart rate slow back down to a normal pace. As I stepped through the front door, the digital clock on the microwave caught my eye. 5 a.m. A wave of exhaustion hit me like a ton of bricks, the adrenaline that had sustained me through the night finally fading. I trudged upstairs, my steps heavy with fatigue. The climb to the second floor felt like a mountain hike, my body begging for rest. I stumbled into my room, practically collapsing into the bed. My eyes fluttered shut the moment my head hit the pillow, exhaustion taking over and dragging me into a deep, dreamless sleep within seconds. As I drifted off to sleep, my mind wandered back to the bizarre adventure I had just been on. The cemetery, the enemies, the grave robberies, it all felt surreal, like a nightmare come to life. Yet even as I lay there depleted and exhausted, a faint smile tugged at my lips. No matter what, I thought to myself, I still love SpongeBob.